Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Nocturnity. Tonight we have some stranded vehicle horror stories for you that will be sure to have you checking your gas, oil, locks, and dash before your next drive. That is, if you can even garner the courage to get into your car after hearing them. But before they start, take these few seconds to hit that subscribe button, because as soon as I finish this sentence, we'll be throwing caution to the wind and diving headlong into the dark realm of eternal night. I grew up in a really small town in Arizona that most people haven't heard of, and like most young girls in the late 80s, had a massive obsession with the most popular group in the world back then, the New Kids on the Block. Also popular at that time was something called thrill-kill gang initiations. This was a phenomenon where prospective gang members would have to go out and kill an innocent person in order to be initiated. One method that was used was for the initiate to drive at night with his, or her, headlights off, inviting cars passing by to flash their headlights at them to let them know that they're off, a common courtesy drivers give to one another. Only in this case, the car with the lights off had them that way on purpose, and the unlucky person who would flash their lights at them would unwittingly volunteer to become a victim, as the prospective gang members would pull a fast U-turn, chase down the car who flashed them, and kill them in cold blood. Well, when my father, my fantastic father, who saved money for months to surprise me with tickets to the New Kids concert in LA and a night stay at a nice hotel, just the two of us, when he surprised me with those tickets, it was the best day of my life. The road trip out there would be the first one that I'd ever taken. The first time I'd see anything outside of our small town. It was so exciting. A 10-hour drive full of road games, music, and laughs, finally resolving with us arriving in town with just enough time to check into the hotel, get ready, and race out to the Forum for the concert. The whole thing, from waking up in Arizona to waking up in LA the next morning, was a magical experience. The ride home, on the other hand, was a nightmare of immeasurable proportions. Well, first of all, after we checked out, our car wouldn't start, so we had to get it towed to a garage to get it looked at. Whatever the repair was, it took all day, and the last of my dad's money. Meaning, although we had half a day's drive ahead of us, by the time we were leaving, which was around 9 p.m., we had to do it because we didn't have the money to just stay another night and leave the next morning. And things only got worse. I'm sure you know where this is going. As we left LA, we were driving down an empty stretch of highway when we passed a car with its headlights off. So my father flashed his at them, telling me that it was his duty to do so and saying, "You always have to do that because those people are at risk of seriously hurting themselves or someone else on the road." The sickening irony of that statement couldn't be any more hard to take. Right away, the car peeled around and chased us down, flipping on their headlights as soon as they were right up onto our bumper. At first, my dad thought it was just a horrible driver, until they flew around to the driver's side of our car and flashed guns out the window, pointing them at my dad and demanding that he pull over. Knowing that it could be the last decision he ever made if he listened, my dad put the pedal to the metal and we took off down the street as he told me to hold on tight. Inside, I was freaking out, completely terror-stricken, but in the midst of the situation, I was silent, watching the open road ahead of us as we rocketed down it at a breakneck speed. My father was driving so well, staying cool and in full control while keeping his eyes on both our tail and the road ahead. But then, fate would have an evil laugh at our expense as a loud bang came from the motor and the gas pedal no longer did its job. It was the first time I heard my dad curse, and he cursed a lot as our car slowed to a stop, allowing the car chasing us to easily catch up. But right before they did, my dad turned to me and told me not to be scared. "These are bad men, and they want to rob us," he explained. "Just give them what they want and they'll go away. Be brave." Those were the last words he said before the car pulled up on his side. The occupants, 4 of them, all wore bandanas over their faces. All I could see was their eyes between those bandanas and their baseball hats. They didn't even step out of the car. As soon as they stopped, The one in the front passenger seat just aimed his gun at my father and started blasting shot after shot. I was in such shock I just watched it happen without making a move or a sound. After he'd shot my dad with over half a clip, he leaned out his window more to get a good look at me while the driver yelled at him to shoot the witness. He aimed the gun at me, and I could see the guilt wash over his eyes when he saw that I was just a scared child. I looked right back at him with a clear view of the barrel of his gun, knowing at any second I'd feel what my poor father had just endured. "Do it!" someone shouted from inside their car. We shared that moment, looking into each other's eyes, just before he pulled the trigger another 3 times, missing me by a mile. I'd say intentionally, and then he fell back into his seat and yelled at the driver to go, and off they went. I sat there frozen, only coming back to earth when my father suddenly let out a huge, bloody cough. He then grumbled at me to find a payphone and call an ambulance, before he was making only gurgling sounds with his eyes rolling back into his skull. The next bit is a blur to me. I remember running down the middle of the road for how long I don't know, and a car swerving to miss me. A woman then got out of it and managed to decode my frantic ramblings. She drove to the closest business and ran in to call the police. My father was then rushed to the closest hospital, which was on a university campus. And by the grace of God, after being shot 7 times in the chest, throat, face, and hand, he survived the incident with no major injuries to haunt him after they had healed. My father's assailant was never caught, though. But judging by his life choices, I'm sure he never made it that far anyways. I must admit, a part of me thanks him for deciding against killing me, even though he was being pressured to. I guess that shows that some moral goodness can sometimes be found, even in the worst of us. Just after the fall of the Soviet Union, I was tasked by my company to get our products into Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic countries. This meant for the next few years, I was traveling back and forth from New York to Eastern Europe on a regular basis. It got to the point that I started to refer to Moscow as my second home, no longer needing a guide to drive me to my motel or to meetings. I literally owned my own car out there. I had friends, favorite places to eat, and so on. I loved the place. However, a common misconception lies in the supposition that Russia automatically became a safe place after the fall of communism. On the contrary, it can be argued that in many ways, Russia became a much more dangerous place. One example is the rise of organized crime. There were certain parts of the city in what I guess we could refer to as Greater Moscow that I was strictly advised to not even drive through, and for the most part, I listened to those warnings. But as time moved on, I got brash and started driving through some of them for convenience. Shortcuts, in other words. One such time was an evening in December, when the night comes before supper and snow never ceases. I was driving through a neighborhood known for extremely high levels of crime, completely mob-run, when my car started making grinding noises. Soon after, it started jolting and halting, until it came to a complete stop and the engine breathed its last pathetic breath. Turning the key in the ignition did nothing, like absolutely nothing, not even a failed attempt at a startup. I was well aware of what part of town I was in, and that scared me, because from what I gathered, the people around there wouldn't think twice about killing you in order to take 1 ruble out of your pocket, and they'd do it before they even knew if you had one to steal. Driving an executive car certainly didn't make me look moneyless either. On top of that, as I said before, it was dark, freezing cold, and only getting colder. If I couldn't get my car going, I was going to have to find somewhere to get inside or I'd freeze to death. Popping the hood, I jumped out to see if I could see anything out of sorts. Even though I couldn't fix an American car if my life depended on it, a Russian machine would probably be even more complicated. And as I expected, I had no idea what the problem was. But as I glanced around the open hood to the street beside it, I saw a person approaching on foot. This made me nervous. It's okay though, I told myself. Those are just stories people were telling you about this part of town. There are nice people in every neighborhood. Of course, in the back of my mind was the fear this was going to get ugly very fast. "What's the problem?" he said as he stopped beside the hood and took a look inside. He was a young man. He couldn't have been older than 18, and seemed harmless enough. And more to the point, he asked the question and eyed the engine as if he could actually be a help to me. Thank God, I thought to myself. I'm not sure, I answered. It just stopped working. As soon as I started talking, his eyes flashed up to look at me with a mischievous grin. I could speak fluent Russian, but I definitely had an accent. I have tools at home just around the corner, he then informed me. I'll be right back. Before I could really respond, he was already on his way down the road and turned a corner and disappeared. Part of me was optimistic, thinking, good, I'll be able to get out of here soon, while another larger part gave me a sinking feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. And that sinking feeling only got worse as a few moments later, that young man came back around the corner with a group of about 10 other men, from his age to probably older than me at the time. I was in my late 20s, and none of them were holding tools. Still standing in front of my open hood, they surrounded me. The alpha of them was a thick, unkempt man I'd guess was around my age, with a mean face that looked more Russian than the flag itself. He stood in the center of their group and addressed me in English. Are you American? I nodded and spoke in English as well. That's right, I'm an American. He turned towards a massive man to his left and spoke in Russian, saying that by the look of me, I had wealth. I guess the young man I had originally spoken to only mentioned that I was American, but not that I spoke Russian, because this guy was speaking to his mates as if I couldn't understand him. He turned back to me and continued in English. Why are you in Russia? I told him the truth, that I was there on business and that Russia was like a second home to me. I was there so often. He turned to that same oaf and said something in Russian that nearly made me piss my pants after that. He said, we could probably get a lot more for his life than the car he came here in. Wait a second, I said in Russian, surprising them all, except that original young man, who stood staring at me with a shit-eating grin on his face the entire exchange. Meanwhile, the alpha in front of me contorted his face into an expression of pure anger, realizing that the jig was up, that I'd been understanding them the whole time. The conversation then officially came to a close, and the violence erupted. I knew it was coming too. I could feel it, and tried my best to run. But as I did, a hard fist connected with my temple, and I fell sideways onto the open engine before being grabbed and thrown down to the ground. It was then a free-for-all. They beat me without mercy until I was barely conscious, and then dragged me through the snow around the corner, where I was thrown into the side sliding door of a van, accompanied by a few of those thugs, and beaten some more until I blacked out completely. I woke up in amazing pain, beaten, bruised, swollen, bloody, and tied to a beam inside an abandoned building with that same man in front of me, the one I referred to earlier as an alpha, and his enforcer, the oaf, standing right next to me. The alpha held up a business card of the company I was working with in Moscow that he'd taken out of my wallet. Is this who you work for? He asked in Russian. With the limited vision and strength that I had left in me, which wasn't much at all, I looked and confirmed that it was. You'd better hope they value your business. He took a few steps back as the man to my right put on a balaclava and pulled out a pistol. Placing it to my temple, I closed my eyes tight to brace for the shot that I was basically inviting. Anything would have been better to me at that point than more torture at the hands of these animals that had reduced me to the inhuman position I was in at the moment. And then the trigger was pulled. However, it wasn't the trigger on the gun. I heard the sound of a flash go off and opened my eyes to see the alpha pulling the trigger on a Polaroid instant camera. The enforcer then took off his balaclava and joined the alpha to look at the picture as it developed in his hands. After it did, they both nodded in satisfaction, and then they turned around and left me there all alone. Hours passed, and night turned into day, and then back to night again. My rampant thirst was only surpassed by my excruciating pain. All hope was lost. I resigned myself to my own death, too weak to even question why such a series of circumstances had brought me there. Why, after such a peaceful life, it was all ending in such a horrendous way. And as my eyes closed and I hung my head, The sounds of frantic chatter and movement filled the empty spaces around me, though I was too weak to lift my head or even open my eyes to see what was happening. I would only learn that weeks later, when I awoke from a coma in Kremlin Central Hospital in Kuntsivo. What my captors had done was take my Polaroid before taping it to a ransom note, which was then faxed to the company I was working with in Moscow with instructions. A ruble amount, which equaled around 25,000 American dollars, was set as my ransom. Not too much to cause a federal case, but not too little by any means either. In other words, the company would more than likely pay it before alerting the authorities. Of course, they were told if they did alert the authorities, I would be killed and it would be filmed and sent to my family members in America. The rest of the note simply stated that I was in an undisclosed location, badly hurt and tied to a beam, and would starve to death or die from my injuries if not tended to hastily. After the ransom money was left and collected safely from a drop point, my location would be faxed over. I thank God every day the company worked so fast to get that location, because they saved my life. And after a long period of recovery, I was able to return to living it with an appreciation for it I didn't know was possible. For the record, the men who did that to me were never arrested. It was well known who they were, but as I said earlier, the country was run by organized criminals, and a few of those guys were highly connected, believe it or not. So I guess, in the end, if I'm to impart any wisdom to you, it's to listen to locals when they tell you to avoid an area, and to always remember that shortcuts, while always tempting, can be lethal. I've lived my entire life in Ashland, Wisconsin. I grew up in the southern part of town and now, as a married man, live right on the shore of Lake Superior. Before we were married, though, my wife lived across the bay in Washburn. So while we were dating, I'd have to drive all the way around the horn of Chequamegon Bay to see her. Don't get me wrong, I didn't mind the drive. I was so in love with her, well, I still am, I would have swam to see her if I had to. However, one night while driving home on the empty highway between Ashland and Washburn, I ran into a situation that ranks up there as one of the worst experiences of my entire life. It was quite late, probably around 11:30, on a clear night in the beginning of spring, when suddenly I heard what sounded like a cannon blast, accompanied by my car violently swerving to the right. I almost couldn't control it, and struggled with all my might to safely slow it down and pull off to the side of the road. After taking a second to get a hold of myself again after such a sudden scare, I opened my door and walked around the car to find my front passenger side tire was blown right out. Anyone who's blown a tire knows the frustration that I felt. But not only did I have to change it out there in the dark, all alone, but despite being clear, it was freezing out. But of course, you gotta do what you gotta do. So as I cursed my luck and grumbled as many swear words as I knew to myself, I walked back to the driver's side door and hit the button beside the seat to pop the trunk, leaving the door open as I then went to the rear of the car to grab the spare tire from it. After pulling it out, I went back to the front passenger side, dropped it, and began to make my way back to the trunk to grab the jack, when suddenly I felt a tingly feeling. It was like I could sense danger. Maybe I'd heard something without fully registering it, or saw something out of the corner of my eye, I don't know, but something got my alarm bells ringing. I looked around at the brush beside the road and saw nothing, which gave me a second of calm before turning around and looking into the passenger side window of the car, just in time to witness the ass end of a wolf right outside my open driver's side door, while it disappeared while heading towards the back end of the vehicle. I froze solid for a brief moment before realizing I had to do something, so I reached for the passenger side handle to find it locked. Damn it, I lamented to myself inside my panicked head as I began to back up slowly and silently. I then stopped dead in my tracks as he came around from the rear end to face me. He too stopped. Not as if he was surprised to see me there, but as if he had found what he was looking for. I didn't know what to do. A million thoughts were racing through my head at the speed of light. Most notably, I knew I had to get away. But I also knew if I began to run, he was coming after me, and he was quicker than I. But the decision to make a move turned out to be all his. Putting his head down a little lower, he started to slowly creep towards me, and with every step he took forward, I took one back. Within a couple, he began to show his fangs. My heartbeat was nearly audible at that point, it was beating so hard, and it only increased when he began to growl. He was right about to pounce. I could feel it with every instinct I had. So, in a last-ditch effort of desperation, I threw caution to the wind and rolled back onto the hood of my car just as he lunged towards me with a loud gnarl, missing my leg by 1/8 of an inch. I could feel my pant legs sway with the motion of him as he flew by me and gnashed his teeth in the air. We'd officially crossed the threshold into battle. I did my best to scramble up my windshield to the roof of my car, seeing then the wolf had smacked right into another. That's right, there was one right behind me that entire time that I had no idea about. Had I not chosen to hop up on the hood when I had, they would have had me from the front and back. But at that point I was still alive and unharmed. But the madness had just kicked off. Now in a fury, one of the wolves hopped up onto the hood while I rose to my feet on the roof. Sure, this would all be over soon and I'd be fresh meat for the night. But the wolf's claws weren't accustomed to the smooth metal and it tap-danced for a second before crashing down on its side and sliding back down to the ground. I used that opportunity to make my second make-or-break move and hopped down beside my open driver's side door and did my best to heave myself inside the car. But I wasn't fast enough. While I did land ass first on the seat, one of those ferocious beasts got in there in time to latch onto the leg that was still sticking out the door and mauled it like only a hungry wolf could. I screamed from both the pain and the terror and kicked full force with my other leg right at its face, contacting well enough to break free of its grip. But he was relentless and came back before I could wind my free leg up again. But by some miracle, before he made contact, and just as his partner rounded the corner to join in on the attack, my hand leaned on the horn while I tried to steady myself and gave them both a jump, proving to be the one tick on the clock that I needed to slam my door shut. Out of instinct, I hit the power locks as if they knew how to open a door. It's funny what a mind makes us do in a panic. And a panic I was surely still smack dab in the middle of. My terror hadn't subsided a bit, and I screamed and fell back as they jumped up with their teeth gnashed at the closed window. I just kept honking the horn. It was literally my only line of defense. I would have started the damn thing if I could have found my keys, but as I then rifled through my pockets, my memory shot me a vision of putting them down in the trunk beside the jack as I grabbed the spare. I was stuck, and in no time, more wolves showed up. There was 8 in total, and they quickly got used to the horn, or at least figured out that it wasn't going to hurt them. And so they just stalked outside the car, looking for a way in. A few always staying by the driver's side door, eyeing me up with fury and hunger in their eyes, growling, howling, and barking. They were the most vicious and intimidating verbal threats you could imagine, and not a word was said. After being in the car for a couple minutes, I guess my shock partially wore off, and I began to feel the enormous pain in my right shin. Looking down, I almost fainted when I saw what that thing had done to my leg. My pant leg and skin were torn to shreds, and there was blood everywhere. In my flustered state, I'm lucky I had the mind to wrap the blanket I had covering the back bucket seats around the wounds, and then take my shoelaces out and tie them together to fasten around it. It was then a waiting game. I sat back and caught my breath and tried my best to calm down as they continued their madness on the other side of my door, separated by a few thin pieces of metal and an even thinner pane of glass. Yet they did the trick to keep me safe. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, they finally gave up and took off into the bushes. Regardless, I still waited in my car for another hour or so, until a passing car decided to pull over, seeing my trunk wide open and stopping to see if I needed any help. It was an older couple, probably in their late 60s or early 70s, and they were nice enough to rush me to the hospital, where I received over 60 stitches and a tetanus shot for my troubles. I thanked that couple and the doctors who treated me to no end, and to this day, I still thank God every night in my prayers for letting me make it out of that situation alive. Well, my friends, we made it out alive again from another dangerous trip through nocturnity. I hope you enjoyed the ride. If so, help us grow by clicking the like button, and if you'd be so kind and want to go the extra mile, give this video a share to your social media. Many more episodes packed with epic horror and thriller stories are on the way, as well as specials we have in the works. So don't be shy and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. It'll be the best decision you make all day. And if you can't wait until our next release, feel free to go over to the Nocturnity Zone channel right now. There are dozens of stories waiting for you there. Until next time, my friends, stay safe.